All right, welcome everyone. My name is Jessica Main and I'm a faculty member at the University of British Columbia in the Department of Asian Studies. I teach courses on Buddhism and I specialize in modern Japanese Buddhism and social ethics. I have the privilege to direct the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation program in Buddhism and Contemporary Society. I acknowledge that the place where I live and work and where the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation program in Buddhism and Contemporary Society is hosted is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation. The land UBC Point Grey campus is situated on has always been a place of learning for the Musqueam people, and in that spirit, we gather virtually from many places, whether the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Stolo, or Tsleil-Waututh of the Vancouver area, or from the lands of other Indigenous peoples around the world. And we gather in that spirit to learn from one another tonight. Through the generous support of the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation, the program in Buddhism and Contemporary Society enables undergraduate teaching about Buddhism and brings in a variety of scholars and community leaders to UBC as part of a distinguished speaker series, annual symposia, and a biannual academic conference. I'm so very pleased to announce that the Family Foundation has gifted an additional $1.5 million to their original endowment at UBC to enhance administrative support for our program, creating further opportunities for teaching, research, and growing academic networks. I want to thank the Foundation for this incredible gift and their support of Buddhist studies at UBC and worldwide. Tonight, we have a symposium on a topic that is of great philosophical interest to me as a scholar of Pure Land Buddhism, and that is the role of spiritual power and influence on the Buddhist practitioner that originates from the other, beyond the known self, and that this power and influence plays a vital role in the practitioner's spiritual liberation. To put this more simply, what affects liberation from beyond the known self? We have 5 panelists that will discuss this question through the Buddhist textual tradition across Indian, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese Buddhist sources. This panel is part of a series organized by the North American District of the International Association of Shin Buddhist Studies. I will give you a very brief outline of our schedule before turning the podium over to 2 more introducers and then the panelists themselves. From the start until about 6:50, each panelist will present their work and then take 1 or 2 questions. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I will receive the questions and then proceed to choose a few to ask the presenter. From 6:50 to 7:05, we'll take a 15-minute break. Then from 7:05 to 8 p.m., we'll gather again and have open discussion between the panelists and take more questions from the audience. Now I'd like to invite Professor Scott Mitchell to say a few words about the ISBS and the series, and then to invite Professor Ken Tanaka to introduce the topic of our symposium today and each presenter.
Thank you, Dr. Main. My name is Scott Mitchell. I am the Dean of the Institute of Buddhist Studies, but tonight I am representing the North American District of the International Association of Shin Buddhist Studies, and it's my great pleasure and honor to be here today. I'm currently in Berkeley, which is the ancestral home of the Chochenyo Ohlone people. Tonight's panel is part of a series, as Professor Main mentioned, of the International Association of Shin Buddhist Studies and our partnership with the American Academy of Religion. Ordinarily, we would be hosting this panel during the annual meeting at the AAR, but 2020 has proven to be challenging. So instead, we are joined together here virtually, and I want to thank Professor Main and especially the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation and UCB for hosting this event and bringing us all here together tonight. I'd also like to thank Michelle Strauss and Wong, who are doing IT and hosting the event and doing all of the difficult work that is challenging for folks like myself. The real work of this panel, however, was the inspiration of Professor Ken Tanaka, who will be speaking here in a moment. This idea of bringing together multiple scholars from multiple fields and interests to talk about a central concept within Buddhism that is often understudied was really his idea and inspiration. And I'm greatly pleased that we're able to host this event. And I'm looking forward to being able to continue this conversation in future symposia, either online or next year in San Antonio, as they say. So without further ado, I will turn the virtual podium over to Professor Tanaka, who will do a much better job of introducing the topic and speakers than I possibly could. Thank you.
Okay, hello from Tokyo, Japan. We're very pleased to have all of you participate. We are looking forward to a wonderful panel. I would like to share. Okay, so the symposium is entitled Other Power in Indian, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese Buddhism, Its Nature and Role in Buddhist Awakening. We have 5 panelists, including myself. I am Professor Emeritus at Musashino University in Tokyo. Professor David Eckel, Professor at Boston University. Professor David Matsumoto, Professor at the Institute of Buddhist Studies and Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. Charles Mueller is professor at Musashino University, who actually took over my position when I retired 3 years ago. But he came from the University of Tokyo, where he is Professor Emeritus. Professor Mark Blum is from University of California at Berkeley. Just a disclaimer here, as you notice, we're all men, older men. And I am partly to blame for this lack of diversity, in that when I thought about this topic and I hit the age of 70, I began to think, hey, you know, there's not too much longer for us. So I wanted to hear from those who had made their marks on this topic and others for this panel. So that is why we ended up with all guys, all older guys. But in the next year's program, because this is a 2-part series, we hope to have greater diversity in terms of gender and youth. So let me explain a little bit why we chose this topic. And basically, as was noted earlier, other power is not very clear for a lot of people, including some Buddhist scholars. And for, it also smacks of, grace found in other religions, especially monotheistic religions. And I think it goes against the image that we have of Buddhism, because Buddhism at its core is monastic, and monasticism requires, self-cultivation, not other power. And often other power is thought of as a teaching found only in Pure Land Buddhism and or in devotional forms. However, as we hope to show in this panel, or during this symposium, that other power is prevalent in many streams of Mahayana Buddhism, and that not only other streams, but it's philosophical traditions as well, and found in writings by scholar monks. So we have come up with a working definition, which Professor Main also alluded to, is a working definition of other power. So we'll be working off of this to a great extent. So a spiritual power or working that originates from the other, beyond the known self, to play a vital role in the aspirant's spiritual liberation or awakening. Very simple, but succinct, I hope. On this panel, we would like to address many issues and questions, but at least we like to address the following 3 main questions. One I call doctrinal. So in which doctrines are the dimensions of other power found? In other words, primarily in the Mahayana Buddhism, which teachings and doctrines reflect other power as just defined? So as candidate for these doctrines, I cite, say, Buddhas of other realms, the Dharmakaya, Tathagata Garbha, Buddha nature, Purva Pranidhana, or prior vow. And Professor Eko will be dealing with this. And I myself will be dealing with Tathagata Garbha. Parinamana, or transference of merit, Adhisthana, empowerment, or originally enlightened. So this is the first, the three major questions. Second one is what I call soteriological, or spiritual liberation, awakening. In what manner and to what extent does other power contribute to the aspirant spiritual liberation practice? So in terms of what manner, there's some examples. The other power appears as Buddhas in visualization, or other power manifests as Buddha nature, as my paper will show, or express itself as the name of the Buddha, as Professor Matsumoto's paper might address. So the second part of this is to what extent does other power play in terms in the context of the seeker or the aspirant's liberation. And so you can see it in two ways. The other power is total. And using the metaphor from a Hindu tradition, the Vaishnavite tradition, that other power would be like the mother cat carrying the kitten by its neck, or the seeker will be like the kitten being carried by the mother. So it's total, the efficiency is totally on the other power. But the other option would be partial, would be that of likened to that of a monkey. A baby monkey would be carried by the mother, but would have to hang on to the mother's body. So there's an effort on the part of the aspirant. So using these metaphors to make it a little bit easier to think about the relationship between the other power and the aspirants in terms of one's soteriology. The lastly is historical. So when in Buddhist history do we see other power become the focus of controversy, especially in relation to self-power? When we use the word other power, it's often used in the context of the conflict or tension between self-power and other power. And so the question that we want to ask, because we have gathered 5 scholars who cover India, China, Korea, and Japan, it's probably first time in if ever, that we're looking at this topic from such a broad perspective. And so we want to know self-power, other power controversy. Do we find it in India, or do we find it in China? So that is the question, one of the questions. So these are the 3 questions that we wish to address. Okay, so this concludes a brief survey of the symposium or the panel. So I would like to now start with the panelists, and I will go first, partly because myself and Professor David Eko were dealing with India. I'm going first because my guy, Saramati, is probably 100 years earlier than Bhava Viveka that he'll be talking about. And then we'll go to China, Korea, and Japan. So, and each of us will have about 18 minutes to present. And we will not have time to respond to questions after each paper. You'll be at the end during the discussion. Okay, so here we go. So my topic is the other power in Indian Tathagata Garbha thought, reassessing the dichotomy drawn between the other power and Buddha nature. So Tathagata Garbha, for those who are not aware, it's usually translated Buddha embryo. Garbha means embryo. Tathagata, of course, is Buddha. So, but it's closer, it means the same as Buddha nature, which is better known in the English-speaking world. So I have noted here Buddha nature. And there has been there is definitely a tendency to see other power in tension with Tathagata Garbha or Buddha nature. The Buddha nature is within and the other power is without. So there's been a dichotomy and with a message that the two are distinct and separate and in fact in opposition with each other. So I want to reassess that dichotomy. So Tathagata Garbha thought is a constellation of ideas that is found in a group of Mahayana sutras and treatises that go back to 2nd century. It's quite early. The earliest sutra is Tathagata Garbha Sutra. And this goes back to the 2nd century. And I'm basing much of my discussion on my professor at the University of Tokyo, whose name was Takasaki Jikido. He was one of the eminent scholars in this field, and I was privileged to study with him back when I was much younger. And so speaking of the other sutras, Lankavatara Sutra, Avatansaka, Nirvana, Srimala Devi, and you see some major sutras, Mahayana sutras like Nirvana Sutra and Avatansaka. So the Tathagata Garbha thought is found in mainstream Mahayana, and there is also a number of treatises, one of which is Ratna Gotra Vibhaga, which I will be focusing on in my paper, and the Awakening of Faith. The central theme message is all sentient beings possess Tathagata Garbha, or the Buddha embryo, the potential to become Buddha. Now, some people think that Tathagata Garbha thought is part of Yogacara tradition, but it is not quite correct to make that statement. It is a separate school of thought, and one way of looking at it is that it emerged to rectify the incorrect understanding that we have of, some people had of emptiness, the teaching of emptiness. Essentially, people thought all things are empty and that they felt kind of a loss of motivation because of the message that he gave, and also because it didn't, the Tathagata Garbha thinkers thought that the emptiness thinkers didn't go far enough to talk about the essential ultimate reality, to which it is very much dedicated. The text is called Ratnagotra Vibhaga and Mahayana Sutra, Mahayana Uttara Shastram, an analysis of the nature of the three jewels being a treatise on the ultimate doctrine of the great vehicle. So the word here, I'll be referring to this text as Ratnagotra. And Gotra is a key term here. Gotra, Professor Takasaki translates it as germ, but I think it's kind of an unfortunate translation. It's more of ultimate reality. It's akin to Dharma Dhatu, or and it's akin to Garuba, which is which I mentioned earlier. So and this text is preserved in Sanskrit, and it also has Chinese, which was translated around 511. So it's quite early. And then it has Tibetan as well. And it's considered the most complete systematic treatment of Tathagata Garbha thought. It appears, the text has the old sections, oldest verses, which Professor Takasaki thinks verses that go back to the 4th century. And the current text as we have received it probably was completed by early 5th century by a person named Saramati. So there's various views on this, but this is probably accepted by many. Now, I wanted to talk. I wish to talk about the relationship between other power and Tathagata Garbha. I kind of referred to it earlier, but it's often the two, the other power without and Tathagata Garbha within, or Buddha nature within, is commonly seen to be dichotomous or in opposition to each other. And because of the fact that one is outside, one is, and the other is within. Especially in the Shin tradition, the other power is represented by Amitabha, the central figure. But the Shin tradition has really negated or criticized any thought of what I have translated, Jisho Shoujo-shin in Japanese is one's nature is of pure mind. In other words, I am pure, basically my mind is pure. But if that is the case, then what would Amida Buddha do as the spiritual source? So this has been often in tension. However, this relationship, as this text will show, the relationship between the two are quite different than commonly understood. So I'm gonna look at just, there's so much in this text, but I just focus on the two verses. And the central message is that all beings possess Tathagata Garbha. So chapter 1, verse 27, the multitudes of living beings are included in the Buddha's wisdom. Their immaculateness is non-dual by nature. Its result manifests itself in the nature of the Buddha. Therefore, it is said, all living beings are possessed of the embryo of the Buddha. Embryo of the Buddha is Tathagata Garbha. So all beings possess Tathagata Garbha. The second verse here is similar. The Buddha's body penetrates everywhere. See, this is central here. Buddha's body as other part penetrates everywhere. Reality is of undifferentiated nature, and the germ of the Buddha exists in the living being. Therefore, all living beings are always possessed of the matrix of the Buddha. So these terms, matrix of the Buddha, embryo of the Buddha, germ of the Buddha, these all refer to the same thing. Tathagata Garbha is basically, philosophically speaking, it's monistic, that it operates from the standpoint of ultimate reality. That's how the thinking is based on that perspective. So now, the two verses spoke of all living beings are possessed of the embryo of the Buddha. But what is important to note is that this truth statement is predicated on the statement, the multitudes of living beings are included in the Buddha's wisdom. So the Buddha here is not any specific Buddha. It's not Shakyamuni Buddha. It's generic Buddha. I call it sometimes transcendent Buddha. And so it reflects the ultimate reality. And so as we hear, so the point is that this conclusion or this statement is predicated or based on this statement here. All living beings are included in the Buddha's wisdom. So it's the Buddha's wisdom that determines that all living beings are possessed of the Buddha nature. So, and the next verse goes a little bit further in terms of discussing the quality of the other power. And it states the Buddha's body penetrates everywhere. Tathagata Dharmakaya Pari Sparana Artha. So, and then this Buddha body here is none other than Dharmakaya itself. as you know, is Dharmakaya is one of the primary terms that expresses the ultimate reality in Buddhism. And so, and here Dharmakaya penetrates everywhere, but here it doesn't say, does not make any reference to the sentient beings, but let me, well, it says Dharmakaya penetrates everywhere. And there is a commentarial section right after it elaborates a little bit more. And it basically says the absolute body, the Dharmakaya of Tathagata penetrates all living beings. Sarva Sattveshu Tathagata Dharmakaya Parisparana Artha. So, so it clearly states that the Dharmakaya penetrates all living beings. So this explanation specifically describes the object of Tathagata's penetration to be all living beings, which I just mentioned. And so the absolute body penetrates all living beings, and the foundation for the and lays the foundation for the truth claim that all living beings possess Tathagata Garbha. So Tathagata Garbha requires involvement. Requires the involvement of Transcendent Buddha. It is a Buddha that is on the level of ultimate reality, which is expressed by such terms as Dharmakaya, Tatata, and Dharmadhatu. The Ratnakotra Vibhaga puts a lot of emphasis on this term, Dharmadhatu, as well as Dharmakaya. It is this Buddha and its workings that make possible the teachings. And I'm repeating myself, but this is the central point that I wanted to make. The other powers working makes Tathagata Garbha within possible. So thus, Tathagata Garbha the Tathagata thought to be in opposition to other power is actually dependent on other power and even constitutes its source. So the other power was a source for the truth claim. So the two are essentially one and the same. Okay, so I think I've demonstrated at least here that the importance of other power in this philosophical text that deals with ultimate reality and also talks about a whole host of practices, the traditional practice of 6 paramitas and prajna and karuna, the compassion. So it's mainstream Mahayana, monastic Buddhism. But again, the emphasis on the ultimate reality. And at the very end of this text, we see that there is a reference for the first time to a specific Buddha. And that Buddha, lo and behold, is Amitabha. So by the merit I have acquired through this, may all living beings come to perceive the Lord Amitabha, endowed with infinite light, and having seen him, may they, owing to the arising of the immaculate vision of the doctrine in them, obtain the supreme enlightenment. So the ultimate enlightenment and Lord Amitabha. So the involvement of the other power is clear. And here we see a reference to a specific Buddha that is important in Pure Land Buddhism. So the very mention of Amitabha reflects the importance of transcendent Buddhas in this text, and which I've already demonstrated, I think. And then secondly, which is of interest, which I cannot deal with here, but there is an affinity with Tathagata Garbha thought with the Amitabha or Amitabha's tradition. Scholars have hinted at this, and there may be in recent years some studies that further discuss this, but it is of some interest. Also, Awakening of Faith also makes reference to Amitabha or Amitabha. So the three questions that I had at the beginning, I know I'm running out of time in a few minutes. I think I'll be able to do it. The three questions, doctrinal. So the doctrines in which Mahayana doctrines do we find other power? Well, in this paper, it's obvious. Tathagata Garbha or Buddha nature, we find other power elements or dimensions. The other one is Dharmakaya and other terms that express ultimate reality. So I think I have responded here to this question. This one, soteriological, is somewhat a little bit complex, but the question is, what is the relation between other power and the seeker? And I would say that in this case, it's partial. It's not total. It's likened to a baby monkey clinging on to the mother. In that, here, I have not been able to discuss this in depth, but I will in the papers that we hope will compile from all the panelists. So the soteriological process would be, one, a seeker aspirant entrusts in the teaching that all beings possess Tathagata Garbha, Shraddha. And then through that, the Buddha in action, there is Kriya. So this talk of Buddha's Kriya, action towards the sentient beings, engenders confidence with understanding, adimukti, in the aspirant, which strengthens the sense of confidence, and therefore enables that person to seek harder and try harder. And then at the end, this practice will lead one to practice traditional practices and realize Bodhi. So the confidence is key here. Tathagata Garbha instills confidence. Tathagata Garbha thought saw itself as an antidote to the wilted mind of emptiness thought. It's called lina chittam, the wilted have lost confidence, but the Tathagata Garbha has something positive. In fact, on top of that, you have other power. Okay, and finally, historically, well, I find no evidence of any controversy between self-power and other power in the Ratnagotra Vibhaga. So I think I'm right under the 18 minutes. So, okay, so now I will change hat and I will serve as a moderator, MC for the rest of the panelists. The first panelist will be, and I will stop sharing here. Okay, so next we have the second paper on from India. Someone is well known in this field, and we are so lucky to have Professor David Echo from Boston University who will talk about Bhava Viveka and etc. So please, thank you.
Thanks very much, Ken. It's really a pleasure for me to be part of this symposium, to meet some new friends and to reconnect with some friends that I've known and respected for many years. And thanks to you, Jessica and Scott, to UBC and to the Ho Foundation for making all of this possible. Their generosity aids the field in so many ways. The origin of my paper goes back quite a few years. Actually, let me put the title of my paper, if I can, on the screen. Am I able to share a screen here? There we go. The origin of my paper goes back quite a few years, to a Buddhist-Christian dialogue conference that we scheduled back in the 1980s at Harvard Divinity School. The conference featured a large group of representatives from the Nishihonganji, headed by the Monshu Koshin Otani. It is possible that this is the first time I met Ken Tanaka. Was it, Ken? Did we meet for the first time at Harvard at that conference?
No, not at that conference.
But
I was still too young.
Okay. As an aspiring young scholar of the Indian tradition, especially concerned with the concept of emptiness, in the major Madhyamaka commentators. I was fascinated by the relationship between emptiness and the idea of other power in Jodo Shinshu. It seemed to me that they could not be as antithetical as was generally assumed, but I did not understand how they could be connected. Out of this question grew the project that eventually became my first major book, To See the Buddha. The question that inspired that book was expressed concisely by one of my colleagues at Harvard Divinity School, Margaret Miles. She asked, "Is it possible to have trust in emptiness?" I cannot repeat everything I said to respond to her question, but in this paper, I'd like to revisit a few of the key points and apply them to the question assigned to me on this panel. What is the role of other power in the Indian Mahayana? It may seem strange, perhaps even counterproductive, to turn to a group of Indian philosophers to elucidate the significance of other power. Their commitment to rational analysis as a tool for awakening might seem to be the antithesis of the tradition of other power that is reflected so vividly for us in the figures like Honen and Shinran. But the situation is not always what it seems. The thesis of this paper will be that elements of other power played a crucial role in the way Indian Mahayana thinkers understood Buddhahood. These elements are not epiphenomena or embellishments on a tradition that otherwise was rigorously self-reliant, but were embedded in the philosopher's understanding of emptiness itself. In other words, they were part of their understanding of reality. The Indian philosophers used them differently, of course. There would be no way to argue that Chandrakirti or Bhaviveka were intellectual soulmates of Honen or Shinran. That would not do justice to either side of the comparison, but my hope is that the Indian scholars will function as a distant mirror to the Japanese tradition of other power, to show not only what was distinctive about Honen and Shinran, but how they shared common concerns with some of the great thinkers of the Indian tradition. Let me set up the problem by quoting a passage from the Tathagata Guhya Sutra. This is the passage that I had on the screen just a minute ago. Chandrakirti quotes this passage in his commentary on the last verse of the chapter on nirvana in the Madhyamaka Karikas, where Nagarjuna said, "The Buddha taught no dharma anywhere to anyone." The passage, as you can see, goes like this: "O Shantamati, between the night when he attained Buddhahood and the night when he attained parinirvana, the Tathagata did not utter a sound. He did not speak, he does not speak, and he will not speak. But all sentient beings hear the Tathagata's teaching as if he were speaking, and each of them thinks the Lord is teaching the Dharma to me. But the Lord has no such concepts and makes no such distinction. O Shantamati, this is because the Tathagata is free from all conceptual diversity consisting of the traces of concepts and distinctions." This image of the Buddha's silence is common in Mahayana literature and poses a basic problem, not only about speech, but about action. If a Buddha has no concepts, how can such a Buddha speak and how can he act? It is possible to put this question a bit further by making a rigorous application of the concept of emptiness. If there is no Buddha at all, how can a Buddha speak or act? But it's not necessary to go that far to understand the force of the problem. How then do the philosophers respond? Bhaviveka gives a possible explanation in response to an objector who says that a Buddha who has no concepts can have no Mahayana. This is a passage next on the screen. He says, "The ultimate Buddha has no concepts, but because of a promise to seek the welfare of others and because of a previous vow. A manifestation body arises from it that is capable of assisting everyone. On this basis, a teaching arises that consists of words and syllables and so on. It reveals to the followers of the Mahayana the two kinds of selflessness. This teaching is called the Mahayana. It arises when the ultimate Buddha is present, so we consider it to be the agent of this teaching. This passage gives a clear picture of what might be called a theory of the Buddha's action. A Buddha has no concepts and cannot act, but the moment of Buddhahood actualizes the conceptual force of the previous vow, and that vow gives rise to the seeming diversity of a Buddha's actions. Now, what do the philosophers tell us about the previous vow? A crucial concept, as you know, in Shin Buddhism. To answer this question, it's best to pay attention less to their theoretical statements than to their examples and illustrations. A particularly good example comes from Srila Bhadra, who gives the following explanation of a Buddha's action. The Tathagata has no concept of effort for himself or for others. But because of a previous vow, he generates insights and manifestations to accomplish the needs of sentient beings. He does not distinguish what he will do from what he will not do, but he still does what needs to be done, just as someone who is in a state of concentration rises from concentration because of a previous vow. As is said in this particular text, the Buddha is like a monk who stays in a state of concentration until a bell is rung. Even though he does not hear the bell ring, he still rises from concentration at the appointed time. In another text, the Buddha's actions are compared to a tie-dyed cloth. The cloth is all the same color, and so is the dye. Cloth is dipped into the dye and then untied. It shows a distinctive pattern. Here the cloth is the Buddha, the dye is emptiness, all one color. And the knots in the cloth are the vows made in the Buddha's previous bodhisattva career. In other texts, we see the vow compared to a potter's wheel that keeps rotating even when the potter stops spinning it. But one of the clearest statements of the relationship between the vow and emptiness comes from a legend connected with Shantideva's introduction to the bodhisattva practice. According to this story, Shantideva, this is a well-known text and it's the next quotation on my screen. According to the story, Shantideva was challenged to make a public recitation of his text. When he got to the chapter on wisdom, he recited a verse that said, "When neither being nor non-being is present to the mind, then because there is no other possibility, the mind has no object and is at peace." At that moment, according to the story, Manju Shri appeared in front of Shantideva, and they rose into the sky together. Normally, you would imagine that this kind of exit would mark the end of the text, but in fact, it does not end. When the monks in the audience went to Shantideva's cell, they found that his text continued for more than 100 verses. The text went on from this statement about being and non-being to talk about how a person could see the Buddha. The form of a Buddha is like a wishing jewel or a wishing tree that grants desires. People see it when they're ready to be taught, and because, here we see this crucial concept again, because of a previous vow. A dealer in antidotes might die after consecrating a post, but the post cures poison even after his death. A Buddha is like that post. He is created by following the Bodhisattva practice, and he accomplishes everything that needs to be accomplished, even after the Bodhisattva is gone. You could say here that the question is what comes after the understanding of emptiness? The answer, it seems, depends on two factors: how ready a person is to see it, and what was anticipated by the previous vow of the Bodhisattva who became the Buddha. To explain the impact of the previous vow, I once used the comparison of a stone thrown into a karmic pond. The trajectory of the stone is the Bodhisattva's career. The point of impact is the event of Buddhahood, and the ripples are the continuing effect of the vow in the minds of the Buddha's disciples. When I mentioned this comparison once to Professor Kajiyama, who was visiting Harvard at the time, he said that he would prefer to think of the vow as a flower rather than as a stone. This suggestion adds further levels of meaning, and it resonates more deeply with the Buddhist understandings of a Buddha, but the emphasis on continuity, on the ripples that spread out from the event of Buddhahood, still remains. There is an implicit connection between the vow and the concept of power in these examples, but this connection can be made more explicit by looking at the relationship between the vow and another concept, the concept of adhisthana, or sustaining power. We can see this connection between these two ideas in a well-known passage in the Lotus Sutra, where the previous vow of Prabhutaratna Buddha is equated with a so-called resolution about his continuing presence. Let the stupa, he says, with my body appear in any Buddha field where the discourse of the Lotus Sutra is revealed, and may this stupa with my body applaud the Lord Buddhas who teach the discourse of the Lotus Sutra. Here the word for resolution is adhisthana, and it's parallel to the concept of purva pranidhana in the same passage. The range of meanings in this new term is almost impossible to capture in a single English word. It has a suggestion of sovereignty or power, as in the Bhagavad Gita's description of Krishna's manifestations. Exercising control over my own nature, Krishna says, I come into being by my own magic. Here, exercising control means to extend adhisthana. But the term can also be used to express a power that continues when the original source of that power is gone, as in the Abhidharma Kosha, where Vasubandhu discusses the power that lingers, interestingly enough, in the relics of a saint. Vasubandhu asks, does the adhisthana continue as long as the person is alive or also after death? He answers, adhisthana also continues after death because it is by the saint's adhisthana that the skeleton continues. For Bhaviveka, the concept of adhisthana comes into play in his account of the powers of bodhisattvas who attain the highest levels of the bodhisattva path, where the bodhisattva has the ability to sustain bodies, past and present, in Buddha fields. In this situation, it's not clear whether the bodhisattva is present or absent, but a comparable passage in the Bodhisattva Bhumi refers specifically to the bodhisattva's absence. I'll read that just briefly. Here the bodhisattva is said to sustain a manifestation that continues when the bodhisattva or tathagata has ceased. The most common examples of adhisthana occur, however, in places where the influence or power is exercised in the present, as in the Vimalakirti Sutra, where the goddess transforms Shariputra into a woman using her Adhisthana, or where Vimalakirti empties his room, again by using his Adhisthana. The most far-reaching examples of the Buddha's Adhisthana are ones where it is difficult to tell whether the power comes from past resolutions or from the Buddha's present action. It's common in the perfection of wisdom literature, for example, to find Adhisthana used almost as a synonym for the Buddha's power or grace, as in this exchange between Shariputra and the Buddha. Shariputra says, "Is it by the Buddha's might or sustaining power and help that bodhisattvas study the deep perfection of wisdom?" The Lord said, "So it is, Shariputra. They are known to the Tathagata, they are sustained by the Tathagata, and the Tathagata beholds them with his Buddha eye." Now, in passages like this, the Buddha's Adhisthana, along with related concepts like Anubhava and Parigraha, seems to function as an analog almost to theistic concepts of grace. It's not that the individual's efforts do not matter, but to say that you have achieved a particular realization by the Adhisthana of the Buddha involves an acknowledgement that you have to rely on a power greater than yourself. Now, much more could be said and should be said about the morphology of power in the literature of the Indian Mahayana. But I hope from just these few examples that the concept of other power is clearly not only present in this Indian literature, but was related in a distinctive way to the intellectual problematic of Buddhahood itself. The Buddha may have disengaged from the world, or according to some traditions, may even be gone, but his power continues to sustain all those. Thank you so much for your patience and for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
Thank you.
David. Yeah, very great. All right, so next panelist will deal with a figure from China. He lived around the year 500, and his name is Tanwan. And we have Professor David Matsumoto, who is a professor and also the president of the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley. And of course, Institute of Buddhist Studies is affiliated with Graduate Theological Union, and is a very interesting setup arrangement that they have, a consortium of Christian seminaries and Buddhist Institute. So, without any more introduction, Professor David Matsumoto, may we have your presentation?
Thank you very much. I want to express my profound appreciation to Professor Tanaka and Professor Eckel for their wonderful lectures and wonderful talks on Indian Buddhism. I'm very, very honored to be a part of this panel. When I was invited by Ken, he gave me a choice of selecting which topic and which text I would like to read, but I noticed that all of my four colleagues sort of moved and they already claimed certain areas in India, Korea, and Japan, leaving China sort of a vacant land, and I felt some responsibility to enter into that land. I'm not a Chinese Buddhist specialist by any means. I'm a student of Shin Buddhism, but I've studied Tanwan for probably over 40 years, longer than I've studied Shinran, and I'm very, very happy to be able to just to offer and present a very brief explanation or brief introduction to Tanwan. So I do have a presentation which I'll pull up for you now. Oops. Here we go. So the title of my talk is Merit and Faith, the Transitional Nature of Taiwan's Approach to Other Power. Oops. Taiwan, or Donran as he's known in Japan, lived at the end of the 5th and into the 6th century during the Nambokcho. It seems he was not very esteemed as a formative patriarch of Chinese Pure Land Buddhism by his contemporaries, nor did he appear to have a major influence on Chinese Pure Land Buddhist thought, aside from his impact on figures like Dao Cho, Shandao, and some in the Three Treatise school. However, Shinran drew heavily on Taiwan's Pure Land thought as he articulated the philosophical foundations of Jodo Shinshu, drawing from Taiwan's thinking notions such as other power, the practices of saying and hearing the name of Amitabha, the two aspects of merit transference, and the twofold Dharmakaya. The importance that Shinran placed on Taiwan has naturally given rise to a great number of studies about their contributions to Pure Land thought and the interrelationship between them. Traditional perspectives on Taiwan and sectarian Shin Buddhist studies have often led to a number of assertions, including the three that I list here. One is the assertion that Taiwan was somehow able to develop a synthesis of Madhyamika and Yogacara thought. Two, that Taiwan was the historical originator of the concept of other power. And three, that Taiwan's other power teaching is in every way identical with the later formulations of Shinran. The study that I'm engaged in will bring all three assertions into question, as instead of viewing Taiwan's principal work through the lens of subsequent Japanese Shin Buddhist studies, it takes a close and critical view of the text and the text treatment of other power. The studies goes on to consider a number of aspects of Taiwan's life and thought that reveal his perspective on other power. I touch upon Taiwan's life and the influence of his thought, but there's not enough time to discuss it thoroughly today. What I'd just like to highlight are certain developments that we judge from Taiwan's biographies, that sometime in his early life, he was a student of the Three Treatise and the Four Treatise schools. Then he turned to Taoism after falling ill, became a very a devotee of Taoism, until it said he met Bodhi-Ruchi on the road, asked him for the source of eternal life. And Bodhi-Ruchi said, "You'll never find it here in China." And he gave him the Contemplation Sutra, at which point, according to the biographies, Taiwan became a Pure Land Buddhist. He wrote at least 3 Pure Land texts in addition to a number of Taoist texts. The Pure Land texts are, and I'll just read the title in English, the Commentary on the Discourse on the Pure Land, and also a text, the Verses in Praise of the Buddha Amitabha, and finally a text entitled The Condensed Commentary on the Significance of the Pure Land of Peace and Bliss, although the latter there's questions raised as to its authorship and authenticity. Taiwan, as I mentioned, had sort of a middling influence on Chinese Pure Land Buddhism, although clearly he was important to the thinking and the writing of Dao Cho and Shandao, who had a great influence throughout China. But his influence in Japanese Buddhist thought and practice, which was much more substantial, and I believe Professor Bloom will be talking about that in his talk. And as I mentioned before, Shinran's articulation of Jodo Shinshu thought and practice drew heavily upon Taiwan's texts. Another point that I bring up in my paper that I won't have time to get to here is the idea that while Taiwan was not the first to introduce the term tariki, tali, other power to Chinese Buddhist thought, his commentary does feature one of the earliest presentations of the notion of other power as it pertains to the power of the Buddha Amitayus, Amitabha. In addition, I take up this assertion that we often find is that the Discourse on the Pure Land, a work traditionally attributed to Vasubandhu, that the assertion that it's a Yogacara text, I believe, is at the very least problematic. There have been a number of studies on this question. They get quite detailed, and we just don't have time to discuss them here. Although I can say that clearly the text was an important one in trying to draw out some of the basic framework of practice in Pure Land, and we'll talk about that. Tanwan's commentary on the discourse clearly offers an integration and comparison between three significant Pure Land sutras: the largest Skavati Vyuha Sutra, or the Sutra of the Buddha of Immeasurable Life, the Sutra of Contemplation on the Buddha of Immeasurable Life, the shorter Skavati Vyuha Sutra, or the Amida Sutra, which persons in the Pure Land and Shin tradition have come to know as the three foundational sutras of the tradition. But it's interesting that in the discourse, it was a discourse on Amitabha sutras in sort of a generic form, without any specificity as to which sutras were in fact being presented. Of interest, I think, perhaps to many of the Buddhologists, however, is that Tanwan's commentary also considers the form of Pure Land Nyanfo practice presented in the discourse within a broader Mahayana context, drawing in particular from the treatise on the great perfection of wisdom and the commentary on the 10 Bodhisattva stages, two texts that had traditionally been attributed to Nagarjuna. Tanwan also refers to and quotes the Vimalakirti Sutra, the Lotus Sutra, the Nirvana Sutra, and other Mahayana texts, as well as the three Pure Land Sutras that I mentioned earlier. In particular, Tanwan cites the commentary on the 10 Bodhisattva stages, again, traditionally attributed to Nagarjuna, at the outset of his commentary, in order to position the 5 gates of Nyanfo practice within the path of easy practice for the attainment of the stage of non-retrogression. He also draws considerably on his study of the 4 treatise thought, making extensive reference to the Daiju Dulung, the treatise on the great perfection of wisdom, again, a text traditionally attributed to Nagarjuna. This study concludes with a suggestion that Tanwan's commentary on the discourse represents a transition, as it were, from a system of praxis requiring a practitioner's accumulation of merit to one of a framework of Pure Land soteriology grounded in a practitioner's faith. That is to say, other power in Tanwan's commentary figuratively occupies a place, here to borrow a phrase from Luis Gomez's description of the longer Skavati Sutra, as Gomez Sensei said, within that shadowy land between merit and faith. This close reading of Tanwan's commentary will allow us to gain a more nuanced perspective, I believe, of his multidimensional contributions to the development of Pure Land thought. The next paper in this project, I believe, will focus on Shinran, and that paper will suggest that a critical study of Tanwan's commentary can allow us to appreciate all the more the innovative and nuanced features of Shinran soteriology, which is deeply grounded in Tanwan's thought. So in order to get a sense of what's going on in the commentary, we have to have a basic understanding of the discourse on the Pure Land, again, a work attributed to Vasubandhu. And I'll again give the English translation of the title of the discourse on the Amitabha Sutras and Agatha of Aspiration for Birth. Again, attributed to Vasubandhu and said to have been translated by Bodhi-ruchi. It's also known as the Discourse on the Pure Land, or in Japanese, the Jodo-ron. A brief overview of the discourse would have us understand that it begins with a gatha, a set of verses for aspiration of birth in the land of peace and bliss. It sets out in detail and in sort of a lyrical descriptions, the 17 adorned virtues of the land, the 8 adorned virtues of the Buddha Amitabhas, and the 4 adorned virtues of the Bodhisattvas in that land. Then in a prose section, the author takes up the question, how should the Bodhisattva visualize that land and Buddha, awaken faith, and attain birth in that land? The answer given, or the framework of practice given, is something referred to as the 5 gates of Nyanfo practices, the Gonemmon, which consists of the gates of worship, which is a physical activity of worship, of praise, which is a recitational or verbal activity of calling out the name of the Buddhas, aspiration, which the discourse explains is the practice of shamatha or stilling, concentration, visualization or kanzatsu, which is explained as a practice of vipassana, of visualizing the manifested features, the virtuous adornments of the land, the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas. And finally, merit transference, which is seen as here being the transference of merit to oneself, accumulated merit to oneself and others, that they may attain birth. And it's said in the text that when those 5 gates of Nyanfo practices are perfected, that the Bodhisattva attains 5 kinds of virtue in order: the virtue of approach, of joining the great assembly, of entering the house and then the room, the inner sanctum of the Buddha, and then emerging from the Pure Land. All of the first 4 represent the entry into the Pure Land. The 5th represents the emergence from the Pure Land, returning to the realm of samsara to teach and save beings. And according to the discourse, the Bodhisattva who perfects the 5 gates of practice and attains the 5 kinds of virtue in the Pure Land realizes wisdom, compassion, and skillful means, which comprise the exquisite, blissful, superior, and true mind of prajna. Tanwan's commentary is just that, a commentary, sometimes a quite detailed and literal commentary on the discourse. And so this is often referred to in Japanese as the Jodo Ronchu, the Ojo Ronchu. I will refer to it in this talk just simply as the discourse, as the commentary, commentary on the discourse. Now in my paper, I go through some detail of reading and going through the Chinese texts, looking at them in detail and trying to gain a very close view of some of the ideas and passages. I think we just don't have time for that. And so I'm going to skip to the end of this. Hopefully we'll have a time in the paper to return to these discussions. But in the interest of time, I'd like to finish up my talk by responding to some of the questions that Professor Tanaka posed to us in my own way, in order to bring, draw together a lot of the ideas that Tanwan presents in his commentary, and to try to present them within the context of the question of other power. So the first question that he poses is, does the other power constitute a dimension of any of the major Mahayana teachings? And as I've discovered in my reading of the commentary, that Tanwan's approach to other power is very nuanced. It's very multidimensional. In terms of Mahayana thought, it's clear that other power is an expression of the Hongan, Purva Pranidhana, the original or primal vows of the Buddha Amitabha Amitayus. For instance, Tanwan states, birth in the Pure Land, as well as the practices performed by the bodhisattvas, human beings, and devas there, are all due to the power of Amida Tathagata's primal vows. This particular statement comes in a section regarding the sustaining power of the Buddha, which I think is quite interesting. And I was very, very interested in Professor Eckel's discussion of Adhisthana. I believe there is a lot of area to discuss in these terms right here. In addition, Tanwan says the power of the primal vows means that the great bodhisattvas with dharma bodies always dwell in samadhi, yet they manifest various bodies, possess various transcendent powers, and teach the Dharma in various ways. All this comes about through the power of the primal vows, or maybe the previous vows might be another way of saying it, the original vows of the Buddha. Tanwan also makes reference to the concept of parinama, of merit transference, as the 5th gate of the Nyanfo practices that must be performed with faith in the power of the Buddha's vows and in accord with reality. Its fulfillment not only brings about the birth in the Pure Land, but it also enables one to emerge from that land and return to the realm of samsara to teach and save beings. All of the Nyanfo practices and their fulfillment are supported by the power of the Buddha's vows. And this next idea, I think, is very important and somewhat unique to Taiwan within the Pure Land tradition. He brings up the idea of the adipati pratyaya, or in Japanese, zojo en, which I translate as the dominant condition. Taiwan uses this notion, likely drawn from the Daju Dulung, to state that the fulfillment of the 5 gates of Nyanfo practice comes about with Amitabha, when Amitabha is taken to be the dominant condition. It's said, one of the explanations for this is the 4th of the Katvara Pratyaya, which could be taken to consign other power to a supplemental or supportive function. However, there are other theories regarding the meaning and the function, significance of the dominant condition as well. And then the bodhicitta, Bodaishin, is also an area of discussion that Taiwan brings up in his commentary. He says the mind that aspires for enlightenment, this is the mind that aspires for enlightenment. Taiwan states that the fulfillment of the 5 gates of Nyanfo practice and the corresponding attainment of the 5 kinds of virtues culminate in the perfection of practices of self-benefit, jiti, and benefiting others, dita. The dominant condition for all of this, of course, is the other power of the Buddha's vows. At the same time, a very interesting section of the commentary comes where Taiwan possibly offers a brief glimpse into his perspective on the meaning of other, or ta. Okay, he makes a distinction between others benefiting, where I capitalize now the other, ta-di, and benefiting others, dita, where I have a small case, o. He says that these 2 ideas, concepts, have the same meaning. However, when speaking from the standpoint of the Buddha, he says we use the term benefiting unenlightened beings as the other. Okay, benefiting others should be used. When viewed from the perspective of sentient beings, then the phrase Amitabha as others benefiting should be used. Taiwan simply presents this idea without much comment. It's very provocative, however, and years later, Shinran would focus on this distinction between Rita and Tadi to clarify the meaning of Tariki. The next question is, when did other power become a focus, if ever, of doctrinal concern and or controversy in the development of Buddhism? I answered it in this way, maybe not a direct answer to this question. Again, Taiwan didn't originate the term other power. We see prior to his commentary, other power appeared, albeit with different meanings in Dharmakshema's translation of the Bodhisattva Bhumi and in Bodhi Aduchi's translations of other texts as well. And the Discourse on the Pure Land contains 2 references. So the original Discourse contains 2 references to the power of primal vows. First in Agatha, which includes the verse, in contemplating the power of the Buddha's vows, I see that no one who encounters it will pass by in vain. It enables one to quickly attain the great treasure ocean of virtues. And in the prose section, it ends with a statement, since this is all due to the transfer of merits through the power of the primal vows, it is called the 5th gate of departure. So it's not surprising that Taiwan's commentary on the Discourse also features one of the earliest presentations of the notion of other power as it pertains to the power of the Buddha Amitayus Amitabha. His emphasis on other power of the Buddha's primal vows pervades his work, even if in retrospect, it appears to be supportive and not the totality of the Pure Land path of easy practice. The third question that I seek to answer or respond to is this.
Professor Matsumoto.
Yes.
Can you make it really short because you've gone over time?
Oh, I did. Okay, I didn't see the note. Okay, I'll leave it till a discussion then. Okay, I'll leave the last part to discussion. I'll just end by saying a close reading of Taiwan's commentary allows us to gain a more nuanced perspective of his multidimensional contributions to the development of Pure Land thought. And the next paper in this project will suggest that a critical study of the commentary will allow us to appreciate the innovative and nuanced features of Shinran's soteriology, which was deeply grounded in Tanwan's thought. So thank you very much. That concludes my talk.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, the next, the fourth paper will be by Professor Charles Mueller of Musashi University, also Professor Emeritus at University of Tokyo. He will cover a figure from Korean Buddhism. So Professor Mueller.
All right then. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our friends around the world. I'm delighted to have this chance to talk to so many friends and colleagues and to participate in this discussion with the esteemed members of our panel. And thanks very much to Ken for putting this together. So, okay. Yeah, so when Ken first asked me to do this, to join, after I thought about it a little bit, I became a bit concerned. First of all, I have never done my own thorough study of the phenomenon of Pure Land or other power in Korea, although I have been working in Korean Buddhism for a long time. But I did recall that the eminent Koryo period Son monk, Son is the Korean word equivalent to Japanese Zen, named Chinol, had, interestingly enough, discussed Pure Land and, well, you can say other power, but we should say Pure Land, mainly recitation of the Buddha's name a couple of times in his work and extensively. Just to talk briefly about Pure Land Buddhism in Korea, similar to the case that Charles Jones explained in his recent very good book on Chinese Pure Land Buddhism, Pure Land in Korea never really existed as a distinct tradition. It didn't form into schools like we see in Japan. And in the Korean Buddhist literary corpus, we see very little in the way of dedicated Pure Land scholarship or commentary. Nonetheless, it's a well-known fact that Yombul, which is the equivalent to Japanese Nenbutsu, has been widely practiced in Korea, both within the monastic and lay community. Again, compared with the Japanese situation, self-power versus other power as in terms of one being superior to another has never been much of an issue. And if you do a digital search through the available Korean Buddhist corpus, you will only find a few occasions where you'll only find a few instances of the terms for other power and self-power. And quite often it's not even in the context of Pure Land Buddhism, just that, maybe in commentary on the awakening of faith or even in some Yogacara text. I should mention that a very good book has recently come out on Pure Land Buddhism in Korea, although it focuses mainly on Pure Land Buddhism during the Shila. A lot of what the author Richard McBride points out about Pure Land Buddhism in Korea can be said to be true for later aspects of the phenomenon as well. So there are two texts by Chinol in which there is sustained discussion of Pure Land practice. Both of these have been translated by Robert Buswell. The first one has been translated. He's translated a few times and published a few times. Very reliable translation. And the second one, also translated by Robert Buswell in his first book on Chinal. Both of these texts are downloadable. The first one is on my website. It's formally downloadable by link. And the second one, I was able to find both the Chinese source and the Buswell's book online by searching PDF copies by searching on the web. So you can get those if you need those. If you don't have time to see this information fully now, just write to me afterwards. I think most of you must know who Chinal is, but anyhow, he's the monk who is considered to be most responsible for the formation of the present system of doctrine and practice in Korean Son Jogye school Buddhism. And interestingly, around the same time as figures like Dogen and Shinran and Honen, who escaped from Hiezan to purify their practice outside of the centers of power, an analogous situation occurred with Chinal, who established a practice center down in the south western part of Korea with the goal of starting anew in a pure disciplined environment. And the first text, the encouragement to practice, is a kind of opening treatise that Chinal composed to commemorate and to introduce the establishment of this society of pure practitioners. What is fascinating about this text is that the entire final third of the text are devoted exclusively to discussing the role of that Yombul practice should play within his system. And I should mention a very important part of this presentation is that this first text is written at the very early stage of Chinal's career, and the second text we're going to look at is written at the very end. And many people have commented that there seems to be a clear shift in attitude on the part of Chinal personally about the role of Pure Land practice and understanding of other power. So in encouragement to practice, Yombul is usually a kind of supplementary, but often a valuable practice. Nonetheless, it is only effective if conducted in conjunction with other standard Buddhist practices, such as morality, sincere faith, study, meditation, and so forth. In this text, this practice is especially recommended for those with limited access to or limited ability to carry out more rigorous or intellectually demanding practices, which is not unusual for characterization of Pure Land in East Asia, historically in general, I would say. There's also in his treatise a part I won't spend too much time covering, but actually the large central part of his treatise is an emphasis on the Pure Land being here and now, depending on the practitioner's level of awareness, which he refers to as mind-only Buddhism, mind-only Pure Land. And in this section, he cites many eminent Chan and Tiantai teachers who advocated the mind-only Pure Land. Most importantly, in the terms of our present discussion, self-power and other power are mentioned briefly, but are not seen as alternatives. You do one or the other, but as mutually supporting practices. So if you read through encouragement to practice, you can discern different types of people for whom different types of practices are relevant. Kind of almost like a kind of Panjiao arrangement, although not that clearly distinguished. But the first group are ordinary persons of great aspiration, and they don't need Pure Land practices because the Pure Land exists everywhere for them. The second type are practitioners who are overwhelmed by bad habit energies and gripped by afflictive hindrances. And for them, other power is recommended to take under consideration. This is a critical paragraph. These people, the members of the second group, must straightaway earnestly make offerings to the three jewels, read through all the Mahayana sutras, practice the path, and perform worship services, repent and make vows. From beginning to end, none of these practices should be neglected. Because their minds are impeccable as a result of their passionate reverence for the three jewels, they will acquire the Buddha's majestic protective power and be able to dissolve their karmic obstructions. Their wholesome faculties will never degenerate. If in this manner they can employ self-power and other power, both internally and externally, determined to seek the supreme path, how would then this not be utterly splendid? So the part in red is telling us that the previous text should be distinguished into self-power and other power. And it would seem that the text highlighted in blue indicates self-power, and that the text highlighted in green indicates other power. Among this latter group, there are again two types of people. Those whose vow to save others is strong, who have plenty of compassion and do not backslide. They don't need to seek the Pure Land. Then those who delight in pleasure and hate the painful, they vow to see Amitabha and achieve Buddhahood themselves. The power of tolerance is weak and they are in danger of backsliding. So again, here, Pure Land practices seem to be recommended for relatively inferior practitioners. But very important for Chinel in this treatise is that mere recitation of the Buddha's name in itself is of limited value. For if in the hopes of meeting Amitabha, they merely recite his name, recollect his noble countenance, and look forward to taking rebirth there, it is obvious which practice is superior and which is inferior. Nowadays, there are many shramanas devoted to doctrinal studies who abandon reputation and seek the path, but they are all attached to external appearances. They assume that facing the west and loudly calling the Buddha's name is the practice of the path. Although it might be said that recollecting the Buddha's name leads to rebirth in the Pure Land, where they receive immeasurable happiness with a body composed of the five aggregates. This is said only because they have not yet relinquished mundane attachments. But nonetheless, he concludes by saying it is better to call the Buddha's name rather than nothing at all, rather than just being arrogant. And that recitation is a good starting point for people who can't understand more difficult teachings. The second text is much shorter, only a few pages long. And again, this is perhaps the final or one of the final things written by Chinel. And in this text, he goes right to Yombul and describes it as a central and essential practice. It's not merely a kind of expedient, but it is the beginning and end of practice, although it still needs to be accompanied by practices of morality and meditation. So the opening passages of the text explain that there are these 3 sets of 5 obstructions, standard Buddhist categories of afflictions and so forth that need to be purified by morality, meditation, and wisdom. And after you purify them to a certain extent, you can begin 10 kinds of recitation, recollection of the name of the Buddha. And you can see the 10 here: recollection of the Buddha while restraining the body, restraining speech, restraining the mind, and so forth. And each one of these gets progressively more subtle, more difficult, but the rewards are greater and also more subtle, more refined. Now, the first 8 follow this kind of pattern, starting off with a passage of what kind of restraint should be practiced, followed by what here is in red, how one should practice the recitation of the name of the Buddha, and finally the result that will be brought about. And so most of the 10 have this pattern, but the causes and the effects become increasingly more refined. In the 9th and 10th practice, there isn't this separation into 3 sections. It's just kind of one is achieved the true Dharma Dhatu, and this is the recollection of the Buddha in thusness. But in terms of the matter of grace and receiving attention directly attention from Amitabha, it is in the final passage where this kind of event is first mentioned. So this is in the final few sentences of the treatise. Chinul says, "You monks, examination of your morality should be the model for your conduct. First, bring an end to the 10 unwholesome behaviors and 8 wrong views. Next, maintain the 5 precepts and the 10 wholesome behaviors. Finally, repent of your previous errors and vow to realize Buddhahood. Focus your mind and establish your will firmly so that neither death nor birth concerns you. Occupy yourself with the 10 kinds of recollection of the Buddha, and over a long period of time, build their efficacy and increase your efforts until you conform easily with the recollection of the Buddha in thusness." And then this is a critical passage. "Then every day and at all times, whether walking, standing, sitting, or reclining, the true essence of Amitabha Buddha will secretly appear before you. He will stroke your head in prediction of your future Buddhahood. At the time of your death, he will personally welcome you to the land of ultimate bliss, into a lotus flower on the 9th tier." Now, Chinul is not aiming for any of this first tier stuff. He wants his students to go to the 9th. Also, in the first treatise, he also has them aim for the 9th tier. So, in summary, and it may not be easy to see in this cursory look at these 2 texts, but if you sit down and read both of them, I believe you can see a clear shift in emphasis and tone between encouragement to practice and essentials of recitation of the Buddha's name, with Yombo in the former text being a kind of ancillary practice, whereas in the latter text, it is the pillar of practice at the beginning and end. In either case, it seems fine for Chinul to integrate it directly into his course of Sun without having to see it as an external practice or tradition. Okay, so we can talk more about this later, but that is what I've got here.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mueller. for an interesting talk from Korean Buddhism. The last paper will be by Professor Mark Blum of University of California. He will address the issue from Japanese Buddhism. So Professor Blum.
So let me first start by saying that I'm not going to talk about Japan very much, but I'm going to lead up to a sort of Japanese conclusion because what I have done in this paper is sort of the first half of what I'm going to do, the second half of which will come at the next meeting. But nonetheless, I will talk about the Kamakura period and what's different about the Kamakura period, but I wanted to share some things that I noticed just in my research on the development of the way the term other power is used in China and leading up to Honen. So I think I have sort of a, yeah. So this is my recent discovery after going through a lot of materials. I looked at about 30 or 40 texts in China and Japan and realized something that I had not realized before, which is the important role of karma in this whole discussion. And so what I'm going to try to argue here is that, in fact, the notion of other power evolved over time. And it evolved over time, starting from before Tan Luan, including the Tan Luan discussion that David talked about. And David didn't emphasize the karmic side of it, but he did mention pratyaya. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And then I'm going to try to show how there's one kind of core. There are a couple of sort of problematics, you might say, in the entire Pure Land tradition that lead to various kinds of hand-wringing, you might say, doctrinally, if not practically. And this, they're not really resolved completely, I don't think, until we get to Honen. And when they do get resolved by Honen, this leads to a political suppression in a major way, including burning down temples, murdering monks, burning books, and some very serious things. So in other words, there is something at the core of the evolution of this tradition that is challenging to the status quo. And Chuck Mueller's presentation of Gino's, view of Nyingpo practice, Buddha Smriti practice reflects the kind of tradition that you can see the kind of so-called Pure Land patriarchs in China are arguing against, trying to push things in another direction to kind of make their point here. And they may not use the term other power specifically as such. And one of the things I want to talk about later is, in fact, Honen does not use that term. So even though Honen is kind of the critical person here in crystallizing what I consider a paradigm shift and how this whole thing evolves, he doesn't use that term specifically, but there are a lot of synonyms that evolve that the Honen and other people use. And those synonyms tell us something about other dimensions of what other power means. And one of which, and the one that I want to emphasize today, is about karma. Okay, so let me, in order to read this, I got to move you guys out of the way. All right, here. So anyway, here we go. I'll try not to improvise because then I'll run out of time. Okay, other power as a concept in Pure Land tradition has specificized the Buddhist theories of karma, but this weakens over time. So particularly when we get to the Shin tradition in Japan, and suddenly the kind of problem of karma gets smaller and smaller. And even within Shin, if you compare the writings of Shinran to the writings, say, of Renyo and the writings of Edo period people, again, it gets weaker and weaker over time. Same thing, the notion of Mofa or Mappo, the kind of historical decline that's also very much, parallel to this whole movement and the way these people, or feel themselves sort of trapped within a particular time frame that also becomes less and less significant over time, particularly on the Japan side. Okay, so the other major point that I want to make here with what I'm going to try to show you is that the term other power in the Kamakura period is specifically after Honen becomes to be used as an adjective. And once it's used as an adjective, the term has significantly different meaning than when it's used as a noun, okay? So that is kind of tricky, and you have to sort of look at the linguistic forms that these things take. And I'm actually, all the examples I have, nearly all of them, I present the Chinese text as well. We're not going to have time to read that, but if you can look at it later, you can look at it as I present it, and you can hopefully see what I'm talking about. So what does it mean that other power comes to be used as an adjective? And my point is that when it comes to be used as an adjective, and again, this only happens after Honen, then it implies a kind of normativity that you don't see prior to that, okay? Prior to that time when it's used as a noun, it is just a kind of conceptual way of talking about how the Buddha influences the world. All right, and so that's a little bit different. And once it has a kind of normativity, then it implies a kind of orthodoxy. Once it implies a kind of orthodoxy, then it has political implications that people see as very threatening. And that leads to this massive persecution, and that leads to the paradigm shift, and that leads to this kind of tussle that happens in the 13th, 14th century that then pushes out something that comes after that, in which Pure Land Buddhism comes to Japanese, dominant Japanese Buddhism as a whole, but not without a lot of pain and suffering. So in some sense, and I'm really glad that Ken brought this topic to the fore, because in a way, it brings out a kind of underlying notion of heresy that we don't see until other power has that kind of normative function. But anyway, that's another discussion we'll get to later. Okay, whoops. Oh. Jeez. All right, so more on sutra usage. Oops, how did that happen? Jeez. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about other power before Tanluan. So as David mentioned, Tanluan is sort of said to be the person who coined the term, but in fact, the term occurs numerous times in translations of sutras. And the way the term is used in the sutras, I think, also plays a very important role as to how Tanluan used it, how the people after Tanluan and Pure Land tradition, particularly Shandao, uses it. They're all aware of this stuff, okay? So, and so I have some examples here, okay? It occurs in the Avatamsaka Sutra, it occurs in the Mahayana Mahaparinirvana Sutra, and the Lankavatara Sutra, the Samdhi Nirmochana Sutra. So these are Tathagata texts, and these are Yogacara texts, in which you see the term other power used over and over again. So it is not exclusive to Tanluan by any means. On the other hand, the way these sutras use the term, sometimes it refers to the power of the Buddha, sometimes other power can simply be used to be some other person's power, like the power of your teacher, okay, the power of your environment, etc. And so sometimes the use of other power does not have a specifically positive connotation that we expect within the context of Pure Land Buddhism. So, so for example, in the Lankavatara Sutra, other power works as a form of causality that may have a positive or a negative effect. So here's an example. By relying on the causality of other power, living beings may get lost in discrimination. That's clearly a negative use. But when we get to the Samdhi Nirmochana Sutra, suddenly here other power is very, very positive, right? And assumed to be positive. Because now other power, the characteristics of other power are the characteristics of Paramartha. So here, other power is not specifically tied to a Buddha, but to Paramartha, to the highest truth itself. And the Buddha, therefore, was just one emanation of that. That's also very, very different. And that's happening again. These are all pre-Tanluan, okay? All these translations. The Dasabhumika Sutta Shastra is similar, divided, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, okay? So here's an example. There are two kinds of skillful rhetoric, self-power and other power. The rhetoric of other power is informed by the spiritual power of Buddha. So in this context, in this example, the Dasabhumika Sutra Shastra is using other power very much in line with the notion that it represents the Paramartha, the Buddha's rhetoric, okay? What is the spiritual power of a Buddha? It is the power of the wisdom of the Tathagata to add something without obscurity. Now, if I have time, I want to talk about this notion of additional, okay? So this is the other thing that's very interesting about the way this sort of canonical use of other power is couched in the context of an add-on, okay? It's something that adds to your situation. I think this is similar to what Charles was saying about the Korean side, where the Buddha is there to add something to where you are at. This is not other power that we think of in the Japanese context as being exclusively other power, but it's other power that adds to the power of my own practice, my own beliefs, etc. Okay, now over to Tanluan. So we've already heard about this, but just to give my take on this, Tanluan's the first person to borrow this language from Sutra and apply it to the aspirations of the follower of the Pure Land tradition. But the interesting thing is that Tanluan also has a connection to Bodhi-Ruchi himself. Bodhi-Ruchi is the translator, and we go back up to these other texts, okay? So you notice that two of these, the Lankavatara and Samya Nirmachana Sutra, both are translated by Bodhiruchi. And of course, Bodhiruchi translates the so-called Pure Land treatise that Taiwan writes his commentary on. So in many ways, Bodhiruchi seems to be a very critical person in this. And I would suggest also, if there's time, a further area of research might be to look at all of Bodhiruchi's translations, look at the way he uses the term power, the way he uses the term Buddha, the Buddha's karma, the Buddha's power, et cetera, to see how Bodhiruchi is in fact shaping the language. Working as a translator of the Nirvana Sutra myself, one thing that's very clear is the Tathagarbha, when expressed in Chinese, suddenly turns into Buddha nature. We don't see that kind of language on the Indian side, but we see it in Chinese all the time. And suddenly Buddha nature becomes this normative, representation of Tathagarbha. And that's because this is the way that Dharma Kshema decided he wanted to render it in Chinese, and it's immediately successful. And so people really like that phrase and really run with that phrase. It's very inspirational. So in the same way, I think Bodhiruchi had a big impact on Chinese conceptions of the kind of thing we're talking about here. In any case, so what is often overlooked is that this concept of the dominant pratyaya, adipati pratyaya, or whatever, that I think David translates the dominant conditionality or something. And so Taiwan says, this is why I recommend that the other power, as it is the dominant causal condition. And here I give you the Chinese below. So he recommends other power as an approach to Buddhism precisely because it is a dominant causality, okay, as opposed to other causalities. Now, Shandao, Taiwan, and Daocho all share a kind of similar, of course, those are generally the first three of the first four patriarchs in the Pure Land tradition in China. And they are also tied because they're all sort of lecturers on the Nirvana Sutra. So they all have very deep Tathagarbha roots, but specifically in the way that the Nirvana Sutra discusses Tathagarbha. So Ken's presentation was great in terms of the Ratnagota Vibhaga, but the Ratnagota Vibhaga in East Asia has almost no impact. It's the Nirvana Sutra and Lankavatara Sutra's presentation of Tathagarbha that really influences people. And so in some sense, they share that kind of mentality in which the inherent Buddha nature within themselves and within the Buddha is somehow external and internal at the same time. And they're struggling to make sense of that within the, you might say, the conceptual framework of the vows of Dhammakara and Amitabha, et cetera, et cetera. So one thing about Shandao is Shandao does not use the term other power, okay? But it's implied in his other word choices. So in his commentary on the Contemplation Sutra, he uses the term Buddha power twice. And even he has this other term, Buddha benevolence power, that to me is a synonym for other power, right? He also interestingly creates another term, which is sacred power or holy power, okay? And he uses the term vow power, the power of the Buddha's vows, very, very often, okay? So, this raises the question, is other power the same as the power of the vows? Does the power of the Buddha derive from the vows so specifically that we can use these terms synonymously? We haven't talked about that, but that's something that I wonder about, okay. So in his Guanjing commentary, Shandao, on the other hand, uses the term yuan, meaning karmic causality, 129 times. There's no comparison to his discussion about karma and causation compared to his discussion on the Buddha power, okay? On the power of the vows, etc. Shandao is obsessed with this. This is for him a huge problematic. And the fact that Shandao is so heavily relied upon by Honen and Shinran in Japan shows that this is also very much a big part of their gestalt. And I think we have to keep this in mind. So here's an example of Shandao's use. Okay, let's see if I can move this again so I can read it. The comprehensive vows of Amitabha refer to, I don't know if you guys can see this. Oops, what happened? Oh, yeah. The The comprehensive vows of Amitabha refer to what is expounded in the largest Kavadibhika Sutra. The ability of ordinary people, both good and bad, to attain birth happens for no other reason that they are being carried by the karmic power of the great vows of Amitabha Buddha as the dominant karmic condition. Again, this phrase at the end of his sentence here, okay, if you just take the karmic power of the Buddha, the power of the vows, you don't need this last phrase about dominant karmic conditioning. The fact that Shandao adds that, though, shows that this is a very much part of his view of how he understands how this functions, okay? And so and again, this is something similar in Daocho. So I'm not really quoting Daocho, but here's one example of what Daocho says. The core is relying on faith in the karmic causality of the Buddha in seeking birth in the Pure Land. Okay, so again, we see here the Buddha's causation, the causality associated with the Buddha that makes birth in the Pure Land possible. All right. Whoa. All right, so karma is not destiny. Thus, consistent with the theme often seen in Mahayana discourse, what we have done as individuals, good or bad, is not necessarily the determining factor in terms of our spiritual future. That is, you might say, the rub, okay? That is the conundrum here. The use of terms like karmic power and dominant karmic causation in the writing of these Chinese Pure Land patriarchs show the importance of having a mechanism to explain why the extent of our bad karmic record does not preclude us from the goal of birth in the Pure Land. And this issue, of course, is the reason why of the 4 chapters of Shandao's commentary on the Contemplation Sutra, the last one, the one where he deals with people who are unable to do mindfulness, focused practice, has been so much more well-studied and so much, better read, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, particularly in the Shin tradition. But this is true everywhere. And that is, the core issue of the 9 grades of beings that are described in the Contemplation Sutra. If all of them aspire to nirvana and to Buddhahood, and they are trying to get to Amitabha's Pure Land as a means to do that, what do you do if you're on the bottom in which your karmic record stinks, right? This should preclude you from having a rebirth before a Buddha. And one of the ways this was dealt with was, are you getting reborn in a Pure Land in which the Buddha's in the Nirmanakaya or in the Sambhogakaya? If he's in the Nirmanakaya, then the Buddha is more or less like Shakyamuni on earth. Anybody could go see Shakyamuni in India because he just appeared like a regular human being. But if it's going to be the Sambhogakaya,
Professor Blum, we're almost at 18 minutes. So
okay, I skipped this.
Could you wrap it up?
Yeah, I'll wrap it up. All right, so here's another term. I'll just run through this very quickly. This other term, sho enriki, is also very, very common in Chinese writings, and it appears in the Shakyamuni Endon, which is attributed to Nagarjuna, but in fact appears to be of Korean origin. And this is, again, for me, the fact that this is related to the notion of other power shows how this stuff kind of evolves in East Asia in a way that's different. And interestingly, Wonhyo has a commentary on the awakening of faith, and he also deals with this business of people of all 9 grades being able to be reborn in Amitabha's Pure Land because they rely on this superior causal power. So even in Korea, this is understood and influential. We get to Japan finally, and we begin to see the same kind of language in Yokan or Eikon, who's sort of an interesting person in between Genshin and Honen. And he also uses the same term, sho enriki, right? Advancing the constant karmic power cannot be derived from people by their self-power practice. It only comes from other power practice, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, we get to Honen and Honen's disciples. And as I said, Honen himself doesn't use the term other power. But in the post-Honen world, Honen will use Ganriki or Honganriki, that is the power of the vows. But but Honen is obsessed with something that Shandao talks about, and that is orthodoxy. So I had this character here for correct, Tadashi. And this is very important. And then Honen's is interpreted correctly or not as advocating a kind of exclusivity, right? That you have to practice in a certain way, otherwise you're not going to succeed. This involves both mental practice and physical practice. And this is sort of the justification for all sorts of suppression of the Pure Land movement. And Honen had to deal with this fundamental problem, which is the same thing. Honen asserted, as Shandao did, you're getting reborn in a Pure Land of a Buddha who's in a Sambhoga Kaya, which normally can only be attained by people who are advanced, in terms of the path. How do they do that, right? And so one of the problems is you can't have bad karma. If your karma is terrible, you can't see a Sambhoga Kaya Buddha. So this is one of the things that Nembutsu is supposed to be able to do. It eliminates that problem. And so this is where we begin to see the use of other power as an adjective in reference to approaches, practices, beliefs, and even goals, right? The goal of rebirth. What kind of Pure Land are you going to be reborn into? What kind of Nembutsu are you practicing? What kind of approach do you have? Is it a Tariki Nembutsu? Or is it a Tariki practice? Is it a Tariki belief system? Or is it a Jiriki belief system? Are you kind of ambivalent about that? Among the disciples of Honen and the subsequent generation, these debates get fiercer and fiercer to the point that when we get to Honganji and Shinran in the Muromachi period, suddenly it becomes one of heresy. And people within their own community are ostracized, thrown out, and this can lead to destruction and death even. So it becomes an interesting issue when other power comes to be used as a marker of normativity in an adjectival way. Suddenly it has great political significance it didn't have previously. So that's sort of my main thing I wanted to talk about today. And then here are examples in the Concord, but we don't have to.
Thank you so much, Professor Blum. All right, we had a break for 15 minutes, but I think we're going to shorten it to about 5 minutes. So if you can get back here at 7 after the hour, we'd like to start our discussion for close to an hour. Thank you. Okay. So I think it's been, in my estimation, the symposium turned out wonderful, more than I expected. I think that it's raised a lot of issues. One thing I would like to steer the panelists to not only to Pure Land Buddhism, but one of the reasons for this panel was to say that other power dimensions are found throughout Mahayana Buddhism, and maybe even in Theravada Buddhism on a popular level. I'm not sure about the monastic level, but even the monastic Theravada, there are elements of other powers. So we want to go back to the original inspiration, which is that, Buddhism is not merely a self-cultivational path, that there are so-called religious, devotional, other power dimensions that need to be accounted for. And but I think in the current paradigm, it's been minimized, and we want to rectify the situation. So thank you, panelists, for participating, and thank all of the participants listening, and to the University of British Columbia and the IASPS, International Association Shin Buddhist Studies. And I wanted to mention more, but please, if you're interested in what our academic association is doing, which is comprised of about 200-300 members throughout the world. And it's not only Shin Buddhism. We had to maintain the name Shin Buddhism for political reasons, but we wanted, we are very clear that it's for Pure Land Buddhist studies in general, as well as Shin Buddhism. So if you're interested, please check out our website, and it's there. And the academic membership fee is very low compared to other places. So please consider. It's the easy path, cheaper path. Okay, so with that, I'll turn it over to our host. And again, thank you, University. I always get UCB and UBC mixed up. So University of British Columbia and Professor Jessica Main, and the institute funded by the whole family.
Thank you so much, Ken. Thank you to all of our panelists who presented today. It was a wonderful discussion. Thank you to all those who participated, attended, asked questions. It was some wonderful back and forth, and I agree with Ken wholeheartedly. It is a useful philosophical and conceptual exercise to consider those powers beyond the known self that might affect liberation, salvation in the Buddhist tradition, broadly understood at all of its levels. I'd like to thank the Robert H. Nainoa Family Foundation for their generous support of us at UBC, the program in Buddhism and Contemporary Society that they established here, and their most recent gift. I'd like to thank the North American District of the International Association of Shin Buddhist Studies, represented by Professor Scott Mitchell here tonight. I'd like to thank our home, the Department of Asian Studies, and the assistants from UBC Arts IT. Our panelists without which we wouldn't have had a night. Thank you for joining from all corners of the world at different time zones. And to our audience, thank you so much for spending the last 3 hours with us to talk about other power. Wish you all a good evening, and thanks again.